So in this demo, what I'm going to do is create a application which is going to allow us to do form-based authentication, sort of a traditional web application, not a single page application, where we can go to a login page and we can end up logging into an app. We can log out of an app and we'll end up seeing specific pages whether or not we're logged in. I'm going to try to do this in as simplistic a way as possible. So sort of minimize what we have to bring into the app. Right now I've just got this empty folder here. Let me do an npm init on it. And there's a couple of things that we're going to end up needing here, and just so that we actually do it with real data, we'll end up using SQLize, and we'll end up using Postgres. So let's install a bunch of modules here. And again, you can do this gradually if you want to. We're definitely going to need Express. We're going to need body parser. Okay? We're also going to need method override, because we're going to have some routes where we're going to want to use delete routes, and we can't do that without method override in a traditional form application. So we've got Express, we've got body parser, we've got method override. Let's also end up bringing in SQLize and Postgres, and we'll save. And instead of actually breaking this down in a ton of different files here, we're going to do it with one file just to keep things simple, and I'll end up putting this up on Git so you can take a look at it. So right now, if I end up opening this up, we can take a look at it, and let's just set up our package JSON file. And what we'll do here is we're going to put a start dev, and since we're going to be doing a Postgres application, and we might end up deploying this to Heroku, let's do a database URL here, and we'll do Postgres localhost, and we'll say auth.db, which doesn't exist. We'll probably have to create that. Let's also just put a couple of other variables in here. We'll do port of 3000, and let's also just so we end up getting some data in our database, let's just put in a sync value of true. And then at this point, we're just going to run nodemon, and we'll run server.js. So if I was to go back here and say npm run start dev, right, we wouldn't end up finding this server file. So let's start building this out a little bit. And for the moment, we'll put this entire thing in the server file. So let's go over here, and we'll say server.js. And let's go over here. We know that we're going to end up needing to connect to a database. I mean, eventually we'll end up bringing this into another file here. But let's go over here, and we'll say SQLize equals require SQLize, which again should be installed. And we're going to create our database by saying new SQLize, and this is going to be process environment database URL. So once we end up doing this, we'll have a connection to our database, and let's set up a user model. So a user model is going to be db define, and we'll say user, so it'll be users table. And we'll go over here, and we'll specify that we're going to have a name, and we'll say that this is going to be SQLize, let's capitalize this, and this is going to be a SQLize string, and we're going to have a password, which is going to be a SQLize string. So this is not in a real-world application, you'd be at least not storing these as plain text in your database, but we're just going to keep this simple now. And again, in a real application, we would end up bringing this in from another folder, but let's just keep it simple. Let's see how many lines we need of code to actually get authorization working in a traditional web application. So we go over here. Nothing really will happen here, but let's actually get things to break by saying if process environment sync, then let's actually make sure that we get the database and all the relations created by saying db.sync force is true. And when we end up doing that, let's come back here and let's actually create two users that we'll be able to work with. So we'll say return promise.all, and we're going to have two users, and we'll start out with Mo, then we'll add Larry. So we'll say name is Mo. Well, keep it simple, do it lowercase. Password for Mo is going to be foo. And for Larry, let's just put these on separate lines here. And we're going to set Larry up with another password. And Larry's is going to be name of Larry. And his password is going to be bar. Okay. So if this is done correctly, we're going to come back here and we'll have a, we could have our data, we could look at our data, but let's actually just put a catch in here just in case there is an error. So we can see it. And we'll say console.log error. And let's see what happens here. So this is running, and we've got the error that the database doesn't exist. So let's open Postgres, and this is going to be our authDB. So we will say create database authDB. That ends up getting created, and here let's go back and restart. So now, hopefully we've got some data that's in here. Can actually test that. And so if we go over here and we say connect to authDB, and we look and see our tables, select from users, we don't see any records here, so let's take a look and just see. Might have made a little mistake here. Promise.all. So this was silly. Promise.all user create. Right, and I pass these objects here, these object literals, and I'll have two users. I was wondering why I wasn't seeing any SQL being emitted in the terminal. And if we end up going back here and we go back, we'll see that we've got two users that ended up getting created. Okay, so that's our starting point. Now let's go and actually start up our application. And what we'll do here is we will say app, and we could say listen. Well, we don't have an app yet, so let's actually create that too. So we'll set this up. Again, just sort of doing this in one file just to keep things maybe a little simple. You see how many lines this really takes to get done. We're going to bring in Express. And we'll go over here and we'll create our application. And we'll tell our app to listen. And we'll just create a variable here for our port equals process environment port or 3000. And we'll have our app listen. And again, in a real app, we'd separate this in two different files, and we would end up exporting this and setting up a server that was aware of this Express application. For this, though, let's just keep it simple. So we will say console.log listening on port, and we'll add our port. And let's see if that ends up running here, which it does. So now we've got our app listening on port 3000. Now let's set up our app. So we're going to end up bringing in a couple of modules here. We're going to need swig. So we'll say swig equals require swig. We'll also say swig set defaults. And we'll say cache is going to be false because we don't want those. We're going to be modifying those pages. And when we end up getting our app, we're going to say app.engine. And we're going to specify that if we're looking for an HTML page that we're going to use swig render file. So we're going to use swig because, again, we have a traditional application and we want to modify what the user sees based upon some data that we send back. So here we'll actually do an app.set view engine, and this is going to be HTML. Let's just see that we have everything, so we can't find swig, so that probably means I forgot to bring that in. npm install swig, save, and we'll start things up again over here. We still don't have any routes. Let's actually set up a few routes. So here's our app, and we'll go in here and we'll end up setting up a home page. So we'll say app.get/function, and we'll say response.render, and the response.render will be index. And if we go over here, now we can go and open up a web browser, and I'll say localhost 3000, and let's actually fix this because we need to put in our request and our response and our next, and go back here, and it's not going to find these views, so let's go and start setting this up. So we're going to set up a views folder. I'm going to add a layout page because I'm going to have multiple pages within this application. So I'm going to have layout, and I'm also going to have index. And I'm going to add one other one, which I know I'm going to need, which is going to be a login page. And we're also going to have one restricted page, which only logged in users can see. So let's start out with our layout. And for our layout, we're going to do HTML. And we're going to want this to look nice, so we'll end up bringing in our bootstrap here. So we're going to have to put a static route in for this, so we'll do link, relate equals style sheet. And this is going to be an href, and we're going to mount up our node modules folder as a static route. So we'll go over here, and we're going to say bootstrap dist css bootstrap.css. There's no JavaScript that we're going to need here, but let's actually go over here, and we'll put in our body, and we're going to put a couple of links in here. So this is going to be a unordered list. Let's give this a class of nav and nav tabs. And we'll go over here and we'll set up a couple of links. So our first link will be for a href, and this is going to be slash, and this is going to be home. And we're going to have home. And for starters, we'll just show all of these things. Login, logout, which is actually going to go to a route, but it's not going to actually return a page. And we'll also have this idea of a restricted page, which only logged in users can see. So right now we're just setting up our framework for this. And since we're going to use this on multiple pages, we need to put some, give us a place to put some stuff in here. So we'll say block, content, and we'll say end block. And we'll just put in some default text, which we'll end up using on our home page. Div class equals well. And we'll say welcome to the auth app. Okay. So let's also just give ourselves a little room here by wrapping this in a class of container. And if we go down over here, we could bring this over here, and let's just indent this so we can tell where things are starting and ending. And at this point, we could save this, and let's just modify. It doesn't like my closing link tags. Let's get rid of it. All right, this is self-closing. Make that warning go away. Let's go over to index and just specify that it extends /layout.html. And I don't need any block here because this is just going to be the default. So at this point, if I go here, should end up finding this. Let's just take a look. Here's our layout page. Here's our index.html. And let's just take a look. Let's just see what this page source is looking like. So it looks empty, which is a little bit weird. Let's see. Okay, so let's just see why it's not pulling in my extends layout here. Maybe I put this in the wrong file. No, that actually looks pretty good. Let's just see what I might be missing here. I'm not sure what was going on with that. Now I'm actually seeing this. Of course, we're not seeing it with the right style, so let's actually go in here down in our app, and right underneath here we could say app.use express static, and we'll say path.join, and this is going to be directory name, and we'll just say node modules 2, 3, and let's just bring in path up here. Again, we could separate this out at some other point. And if we go back over here, let's just see if our styles are working. And let's open this up and just see if it was able to bring in Bootstrap. And that's probably because we didn't end up bringing in Bootstrap. So let's assume that that's the case. npm install Bootstrap, save. Start this up again, and go back here, and we'll see that we have these styles. So we've got home. Login doesn't exist yet, but let's actually start building this out a little bit. So we're going to put some, I'm actually going to put some swig in here to look at whether or not we end up having a user object. So what we're going to do is that if we do have a user, we're going to end up passing this user down to our view. And what we'll do here is we'll just put in a if, and we'll say if user, then we'll end up showing this restricted page. And we'll also specify that if we don't have a user, we'll end up showing the login link. We'll give the user the ability to get logged in, and let's actually move this log out up over here. So if you're logged in, you're going to be able to get to the restricted page. If not, you'll just see that user link, and at this point, this should just basically give me a more simplified view here. Of course, I can't log in yet, so let's actually go and set up that route. So what we'll do here is real simply on the server, we'll start adding these other routes. So we've got our get route, and here we'll specify login, and this is going to be function request response next. And we'll go over here and we'll say response.render login. So if we went to reload this, we'd get a different message. The route is going to end up existing. Actually, the only thing that we'll get is that we don't have anything here. So let's go in here and start putting in some data. Here, again, we're using swig. So we have to remember to say block content. And we're going to have to remember to specify end block. And let's go over here and make sure that we end up doing extends / layout.html. So we've got our layout, we've got our login, and let's go over here and just put this in and make sure this is showing up. Okay, so this shows up. And let's just put a form in here. We'll say form. Let's give it a class of well. So it's got a little bit of a background color there. And we'll put a div here, and this class is going to be form group. And we'll put an input control, and the class will be form control. Let's give it a name of name. Let's give it a placeholder of name. And let's do that. Let's do a second one. And this one's going to be for password. Let's give this one a type of password, which you should do for password form. And we'll call this password. And we'll put a placeholder of password. So now once we do these two things, we should end up seeing this form. And let's go down here and let's put in a button. Class equals btn, btn primary, and type is going to be submit, and we'll say login. Now, so the question is, where should this route end up going? So if we start to think about RESTful routes, what we really want to do here is we want to create a session for the user. So if we think about both session and we think about create, if this is a RESTful route that we're going to create, this is going to be a method of post, and this is going to be an action, which is going to be sessions. So we're going to be posting to a page sessions, and we're going to try to create a sessions object for the user. At first, we'll just see whether or not we can find the user or not. So here, if we do this and we click on login, we'll say that we can't post to sessions. And again, just sort of keeping this kind of quick and dirty in the same file. Let's go down here in our app, and we'll set up this other route. So again, RESTful route, we're going to post to sessions, and we've got request response dot next. And just to make sure that we can see that we're getting our request.body, we'll say response.send request.body. And if we go over here and we reload this, we'll see that it's empty. And the reason why it's empty is, let's go back over here, and we're going to end up using our app.use, and we'll say require, and this is going to be body parser. And so here again, we're not doing JSON encoding, we're going to be doing URL standard form encoding. URL encoded extended is equal to false. So we've got this body parser. Let's reload this, and here we can see we have no values here, but we do have a name and password form that are coming in. So at this point, what we can do, just to see that we can end up finding a user, we'll do a user find one, and we're going to do a where, and our where is going to be name request.body.name, password request.body.password. And if we go over here, we'll do a then function. Either we'll have a user or we won't. And we'll say response if user. We'll say response.send user. And here we'll just say, put in a return here to get out of there. And here, let's just say response.send status 401. So we should end up just seeing the text unauthorized if we make it down here. Let's just, for purposes, just in case we have a SQL error or something, let's do a catch and we'll do next. So now if we go back here and we were to reload this, we'll see unauthorized. But if we go back to our form and we say mo foo, we'll see we could find Mo. And if we go back here and we say Larry bar, we'll end up finding Larry, and we'll end up finding bar. So the next thing is, well, what do we end up doing with this information instead of actually setting it up this way? So what we want to do is we actually want to create a session. And in order to create a session, we have to set up our session software. So one thing that we're going to want to add here is, once we're using session values, again, session values allow us to store information per user in that user's session. So we'll go over here and we will say npm install express session. And when we end up installing express session, the only thing that we're going to need here is a secret for the session, which ends up doing some encryption to make sure that the session is a bit safer. There's some secret that ends up getting used. So let's go down here, and when we end up creating our app, let's go in here, and actually really any point after we end up creating our app, let's go over here and we'll specify app.use require express session. An express session needs to be called, and we need to give it a secret. So we'll set this up as an environment variable, and this is something that, if you're putting this on GitHub, you wouldn't want to expose this stuff. But again, just from our testing environment, we'll just come back up to our package JSON, and let's add one more value here. And this will be secret is equal to foo, or let's say fizz, right? Just to make things a little bit different here. And if we go back here, we can end up running this. And if you wanted to go and now look in your browser here, if you go back to these pages and you end up looking at your application and you go and look at the cookies, you'll see that there's a session ID here. So there's a way of basically remembering who this user is, and if you go in as different users, you'll get different values for these sessions. So it's a little cookie that's going back and forth to identify who we are and really the stateless HTTP protocol. So what we're going to do here is that, in fact, when we end up finding out if we have a user, we'll go over here and we'll just specify, hey, look, if we have a user, the request object now will have a session, and we'll set the user ID of the session to the user's ID. And what we'll do here, instead of actually just sending something back, usually when we create, we do a redirect. So we'll do a response.redirect, and we'll end up going back to the home page. And let's make sure that we end up returning when we do that. If we were unable to find the user, then we'll say response.redirect, and we'll just come back to the login page. Again, it's not going to be the perfect user experience. Ideally, we'd want to give the user some messaging information. But at this point, what we should be able to do is go over here and say mo, and if I just put in some gibberish here, I'll come back here. But if I say mo.foo, I'll be redirected back to home. Now, again, I still see my links here. So what am I going to be doing with this? Well, what's going to happen now is that with any request, actually after this point, I'm going to have the ability to basically grab this from the session, grab this user ID. So what I'm going to do is pretty far up the food chain over here. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to put in an app. I'm going to put in some middleware, and I'll say app.use, and this is a piece of middleware I'm going to put in, request response next. And I'm going to ask the question if I see that user ID. So if request, again, the session object is on the request object, I'll say if the request.session.user ID, okay? And let's actually do it this way. If I don't have one, then I'm just going to get out of there, okay? But if I do have one, what I want to do is have my user find by ID, my request.session.user ID. And you might ask the question, why not just store the whole user object in the session? And really what it ends up coming down to is that you want to store as minimal information in the session as you can. If you imagine if your app started to expand, you'd be storing, the user object can have a bunch of different data on it. You want to basically just store as little as you can to get the user. So all I'm doing here is I'm just going to be storing the session ID, and I could find by ID, and I could do it then here. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to assume that we're able to find this user by ID, and we'll go over here. And if, in fact, we were able to find a user by ID, then we should have a user. And so what I'm going to do here is that I want this user object to be available in my views. And if you want the user object to be available in your views, one thing you could do here is that if you take your response object and if you say locals, what will end up happening here, we could basically pass this user to the response. So anything we put on the locals object is going to be available over here. And this way, this is going to end up getting passed down to the view. And once we end up getting over here, we could end up calling next. And just for the sake of completeness, let's put a catch in here and make sure that in all these cases, next ends up getting called. And let's just see what the impact of this is. We go back here. We reload, let's just see, can't set headers after they're sent, and usually that is a result of really what I need to do here is that if there's no session ID, I really have to get out of here. So this is where I end up putting a return in this callback to end up getting out of here. Let's let this reload and let's test this one more time. Now if I log in and I say mo foo, you'll see that I have these other links here. So now that we actually have the user logging in, let's actually set up how the user could end up logging out. So again, for a logout, if we end up thinking in terms of a RESTful architecture, then really what we're looking to do is to really destroy the user's session. It's not really easy to do with a link. If you were making AJAX requests, it would end up being a lot easier. So what we're going to do here is actually put this logout in the form, pardon the pun, of a form. And so what we'll do here is I'm going to put in a form, and we're going to say the method is going to be post, and I'm going to need to use method override, which I don't think I ended up putting here yet. And here we will specify that the action is going to be /sessions, and we'll say underscore method equals delete. So again, we can't really do deletes, which we really want to do in a RESTful architecture, so we're going to get around that by doing this. And once we end up doing that, we'll close off our form, and let's turn this into a button. Submit. Give this a class of btn warning, and we'll say logout. Now again, this route doesn't exist. We go back over here, and we go back to this page, and we click on logout. We'll find that we end up going back to log in. Let's take a look at that. And the reason why that's actually happening is that what's going on with that is that it's actually not even trying to find this delete route. It's not looking for the right route. So let's actually go back and set up our method override. Again, traditional app, these are things that we end up needing. So we'll say app.use, and we'll do require method override. And again, we're going to call this, and we're going to specify, you're going to look for a URL variable of method. So once we end up doing that, and we go back here and we click on logout, at this point it'll tell us I can't get to this method. This is a pretty easy one to write. All we're going to do here is, again, RESTful routes. Here's where we end up creating the session. And now we're going to do a delete to sessions. We'll do request, response, next. And we'll go over here, and what we're going to do here is just basically say, hey, the request.session can be destroyed, and we're going to destroy that session. So this is a method that the session object has. It'll basically go in and destroy whatever was in the session. And at this point, we'll consider the user to be logged out, and we will redirect back to the home page. So this should now give us the ability to log in and log out. We could log in with Mo. We could log out with Mo. We could log in with Larry. So Larry's password is bar. And we could log out with Larry. And let's just do one thing just so we know that we're identifying who the user is. Let's go back up to our layout page. And again, we see we have access to the user. So let's go over here and we'll just put on our logout button, log out. Let's just put a little swig here. And we'll go over here and we'll specify that we're going to log out. And this is going to be user.name. So if we log in as Mo, we'll see we could end up logging out as Mo. And if we log in as Larry, we can end up logging out as Larry. So Larry is bar. And we could end up logging out as Larry. So, this allows us to, at this point, we're able to log in and log out. Let's just do one other thing here. We know that we have this restricted page. And if we log in and we say mo.foo, we could end up getting to this restricted page. Actually, we can't because we don't have the route set up for it. So let's actually put a little data in here. I'm going to copy this a little bit. So we're going to extend layout over here, and we'll just put a little well inside this page. And we'll go over here and we'll specify div class equals well. And we'll go over here, you are on a restricted page. So now we actually have the page for this. And let's go over here. And we will go back to our server and we'll set up, this is sort of going to be the last route that we have for this. So we've got a get route for slash, a get route for login. And now we're just going to have another get route for restricted. And we'll pass in restricted. And again, just so you note that the user is being passed in here. If there is a session, we're putting on the locals object user, which again just passes it down for swig to end up using. So here, if we go back here and we reload this page, we should end up getting our restricted page. So there's a problem with this. One of the problems is that even though the user doesn't see the link, which is fine, we still shouldn't give them access to this page. So how do you restrict access? Well, one of the easiest ways to restrict access is by using middleware. And what we could do here is that we could say, hey, look, before you get to this page, we're going to put a little test here by adding some middleware. So we haven't done this too much, but you could have multiple middleware functions. This is our last piece of middleware function. But we could put a middleware function called restrict. Now, restrict doesn't exist yet. If I was to go and, try to load this, I'd get an error because restrict is not defined. But I'm going to create this function restrict. It's going to be pretty simple here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say request response next. And I'm just going to go and look at this response.locals. And I'll say if response.locals.user, then return next. All right, I'm just going to get out of there, and I'm just going to end up returning next. Otherwise, let's just go over here and just return the fact that we're going to be restricted here. So we'll just go over here and we'll say response.sendStatus 401. We're not going to call the next. We're basically handling it from within here. So if you get to restrict and you're not logged in, if you're logged in, we're just going to let you go through. If not, we're going to send a status of 401. And so now if we go back to this page, we'll get unauthorized. And again, we could have a page that looks a little bit better than that, but this serves our purpose for being able to go over here, log in. Again, Mo, bad password. I just redirect back here. That's not ideal, but we could always work on that. And I'll say Larry. excuse me, Mo is going to be foo, and I'm logged in, and I can get to restricted. You see I'm on the restricted page. I could log out, but if I attempted to go back to this restricted page, I wouldn't be able to do it. So let's just take a look and just see what we have here. I'm kind of curious myself. So we were actually able to create pretty much authentication within an application. And this is all of our code, right? We've got some HTML that's here, but all of our code is basically sitting in this file. And even with some spacing, right, we've got about 86 lines of code. So again, a bunch of sort of different parts that you have to end up putting together. Again, we have to create our models. Again, this stuff just to make sure that we have some data within our system. And again, if this was a full-fledged application, you might give the user the ability to end up changing their password. We also probably would want to be encrypting the password so that we're not storing them in plain text. All these things make authorization a bit more complicated, but the general purpose here, generally how it works, again, when we're talking about form-based session authentication, is to allow the user to log in, put something, on the session to identify who the user is. So the first thing we have to do is set up sessions, and then we have to say for this particular user, the ID is going to be the user ID is going to be whoever the user is, and we end up finding the user so we can end up passing it down. Just to show you one other thing here, if I go back over here and I log in and I say Mo is foo and I log in, if I try to open this on another tab, right, it's still going to identify me as being Mo. But if I was to go over here, if you wanted to sort of test that out, and I open up a new incognito window, or if I opened up another browser, here I'm not going to be logged in. And if I go in, I could log in as Larry. So you can see each of these folks has two different sessions that they have. And again, the sessions are being, accessed by cookies going back and forth. And again, this is how you do form-based session authentication. One thing to sort of look at from here is how does this end up changing when you have a single-page application where you're not doing form-based authentication? And that's something else that we'll talk about a little bit later on.